So, welcome all. As those who have worked with me in this kind of capacity before might expect, I want to begin tonight by inviting us all to arrive together embodied in this moment. And I want to give gratitude to the teachers whose tools I'm weaving together in this practice. Karina Blackheart, my initiator and dear friend, with whom I received my training as a fairy priest. Stephen Buhner, beautiful, heart-centered herbal teacher of the Southwest. And Sharon Stanley, who I haven't met, but whose writings and practices around somatic psychology have become an important part of my practice. And so I want to invite you first to just take a moment to take a few deep, slow breaths. Expanding your chest, breathing into your diaphragm. Breathing into your belly. Breathing into your sex. Feeling the ground beneath you supporting you. Feeling Earth's gravity drawing you toward her core, holding you. Her gravity is her love. Feeling the air moving across your skin. Feeling the river of breath move through you. Breathing down again into your sex. And as you breathe out, feeling a cord go down from your root through the floor and the spaces below, through dark, rich soil among the intertwining mycelia and rhizomes, through sand and clay and gravel, through the dark, cold waters of the underworld and the bedrock that is the floor of that underground sea, down into the other ocean below it, the ocean of magma that warms the earth from below. Further and further until it anchors on the core of the earth, iron at once solid with pressure and molten with heat. Feel that iron call to the iron in your blood, and feel the iron in your blood stir and return. And feel that fire reach for you, rising up along the cut cord, breathing it in through your sex to fill the cradle of your pelvis. Letting that fire flow down your thighs, into your calves, into your feet, and out to the tips of your toes. Letting it fill your belly and your chest and your shoulders. Letting it flow down your arms and into your hands and out to the tips of your fingers. letting it flow up your neck, filling your cranium, filling all of you with that fire from the core of the earth. Breathing out, feel that cord reach down for the core of the earth. Breathing in, feel that heat rise up through you, filling you, flowing through you. And as you breathe out again, let that heat and that cord rise up through the crown of your head, through ceiling and roof, out into the evening air, higher and higher as the clouds grow thinner, and the air grows thinner, and the sky turns electric blue and fades into black. Beyond the moon, beyond the planets, beyond the rock and ice at the edge of the solar system, further and further until it anchors on a distant star. But as you breathe in, draw down the light from that star, letting it pour through the crown of your head, filling your cranium, flowing down your neck and into your shoulders, flowing down your arms and into your hands and out to the tips of your fingers, filling your chest and your belly and the cradle of your pelvis, flowing down your thighs and your calves and into your feet and out to the tips of your toes, and flowing down through your sex along that cord to kiss the core of the earth, whose fire rises up to touch the heart of that star, and feel them pouring through you, reminding you who you are, child of earth and starry heaven. You were born of this earth, and you will return to this earth. And you are older than this earth. The iron in your blood and the iron at the core of the earth were forged together in the first generation of stars. The hydrogen contained in the water that makes up most of your body, the hydrogen contained in the water that flows across her body, are older than the oldest stars. First condensation into matter of the exhalation of ecstasy when darkness looked on darkness self in the curved mirror of time and space and fell in love and in lust with darkness' own reflection. And as desire grew, as passion grew, heat grew, and darkness began to melt, began to flow, began to pulse, began to flow outward into everything, dividing herself again and again and again for the sake of discovery. And in that moment of ecstasy, when everything flowed into being from nothing, and a sound that contained all sounds, she called your name, sending forth matter and energy to form clouds of dust and gas that gave birth to stars that burned and died, fiery furnaces forging the elements of your body, until on the third planet from one of those stars, water flowed and lightning struck, and life began to move through 1,000 forms, shape-shifting, evolving until it became you, as you are, embodied in this moment, called forth as the wildest desire of that original darkness. Beneath all the stories of shame and fear and guilt, this is the truth of who you are. every particle of your being partook in the birth of all worlds and contains the memory of that ecstasy. It lies in the space between your heartbeats as the echo of that darkness. And in the beating of your heart and diastole and systole is the echo of her pulsing pleasure, her pulsing passion, her pulsing ecstasy, becoming the rhythm of your life. Bring your attention now to the beating of your heart. And as you feel your heart beating, remember that in every moment, your heart has beat for you without you needing to think, without you needing to ask. Even when you were too tired to take another breath, to speak another word, to take another step, your heart beat for you still, playing out rhythms of joy and sorrow, love and loss, terror and ecstasy. Thank your heart now. Let gratitude rise up within it as a wild spring, filling your heart all the way to overflowing, letting it flow out with your blood to organs and muscle and fascia, bringing your body into awareness. And as it passes by your lungs, let it flow out with your breath to bless the air around you, to bless the earth beneath you, to bless the water and the fire above and below, to bless the moon and the planets, and our spiraling galaxy of stars, and the sea of galaxies in which it swirls, stretching all the way out to the edge of the outer darkness. And then gather your awareness back in from the edge of the outer darkness, drawing it in from everywhere across space and time, calling what is right and true to you back to you, in through your breath, where it passes into your blood, flows back to your heart, reminding you who you are. And take a moment to press your hands firmly across your body, feeling your presence, and to feel the ground beneath you supporting you, and to feel Earth's gravity holding you. So in Apocalyptic Witchcraft, Peter Gray speaks about orientation and presence as essential elements of magical practice. And I would say orientation and presence are essential elements of embodied being in this world. And they are our birthright. And when we are oriented to where we are, and when we are present in who we are, and especially in our own sensations, we move toward connection with all of life. and we act intuitively in ways that honor the human and other than human ecologies in which we're woven. But we live in a culture that militates against this. The Oaxacan scholar Gustavo Ocheva says the difference between a colonizing culture and an indigenous culture is that in an indigenous culture, the first layer of being is we. And as someone who has felt alone and disconnected a lot of my life, I really initially struggled against that concept, being afraid that I was speaking of some kind of forced assimilation, some eradication of difference. But then I looked to the living world, as I often do when paradox appears, to try to understand what it would mean for the first layer of being to be we. And immediately, I began to think about the way in which mushrooms grow. So walking in the woods, seeing a mushroom sprouting from the ground, we look at that individual fruiting body and we believe it to be an individual organism. And that's not entirely untrue. There is a sensory experience unique to that particular flesh of that particular fruiting body of mushroom that is distinct and is its own. And yet, it is also part of a larger organism. It is connected through a mycelial web to all the other mushrooms within its community, which share information and resources, and which in turn entwine with the mycelia of other fungi and with the rhizomes of plants to form a mycorrhizal network across which nutrients and information are exchanged. And so we can say that the mushroom is the being, or we can say that the community of mushrooms are the being, or we can say that the forest itself is the being, and all of these are true. But we are beginning then with layers of we, layers of forest, and layers of community that then include the differentiated individual experience of the fruiting body. Stephen Buhner has suggested that perhaps our species is a fruiting body of Gaia. And when we are in fully embodied presence, we experience that we quite naturally. If we look at the organization of consciousness within our bodies, we have 4 major centers of awareness, 4 major electromagnetic oscillators, which each carry a different quality of experience and presence. We have, of course, the brain, which is responsible for processing and categorizing information, making associations, creating maps of reality, and making decisions. And we have the nervous system associated with the gut located in the solar plexus that people are speaking of more and more, that gut brain. And if you've ever trained in a martial art, you probably were taught to center your awareness and presence in your core. And the reason for doing that is that you are then actually bringing your attention into a place that favors the perception of that particular part of your nervous system, which is a very interesting part of our nervous system. It, of course, is tied in with our digestion and things like the timing of the release of bile from the gallbladder, but also seems to be a place where we gather information from throughout the body, that our fascia, which we'll speak of more later, is picking up on subtle shifts in motion and in sound waves around us, and subtle shifts of light, to give us information about what is going on in space around us in this moment. And that is gathered by that bundle of nerves around the solar plexus to become a single impression of where we are in space and of what's happening in the space around us, which then via the ventral branch of the vagus nerve, and we'll speak more about that soon as well, goes to our brain and gives us information about whether we are safe or not. And if we are safe, then brain and gut will remain in communication. If we are unsafe, then we will shift into that gut awareness. And one way that I think probably everyone has experienced this is when you're sitting there talking with someone, and logically what they're saying seems to add up, but you know that they're lying. You have no information to tell you that they're lying other than the information your body is giving. And the information your body is giving is probably a feeling in the pit of your stomach that tells you that this person is lying. And as they continue to lie, you may probably feel into that unpleasant feeling in the pit of your stomach more and more. And you probably begin to process their words less and less and get more focused on, okay, when and how can I get out of here? And that is you're kicking into that gut level awareness. So then we also have two other primary centers of consciousness. Our heart, which Stephen Buhner writes about in The Secret Teachings of Plants and speaks of as the strongest of our three electromagnetic oscillators. It creates the largest electromagnetic field. And being the largest electromagnetic field, it is most susceptible to subtle fluctuations in other electromagnetic fields. And of course, everything in our universe has its own electromagnetic signature. Every molecule, every atom, every subatomic particle. And then the bodies of living things have electromagnetic signatures that are particularly interesting and significant to us. And so that electromagnetic field of the heart feels the subtle fluctuations in the changes in the electromagnetic fields of every cell of our bodies. And if we think about the art of pulse diagnosis existing in so many different medical traditions, and which Grant Stickley will be teaching in our Somatic Herbalist Practitioners program this fall. Ultimately, it is a way of finding the subtle fluctuations in the rhythm of the heart and how they feel to the fingers at certain positions on the wrist that become ways of reading patterns of balance and imbalance, of flow and not flow within the body. And my friend Heather reminded me yesterday that I once said that the only pathology that exists is obstruction or resistance to flow. We are fluid beings. We are mostly water. Our awareness and consciousness flow. And when that flow is cut off is when we begin to come out of healthy rhythm, come out of healthy balance. But we also pick up on the changes in flow in other beings around us. And we do a really interesting thing with that information. So we're processing all kinds of electromagnetic information all the time. So our skin picks up on the infrared radiation of heat and carries a tactile nerve signal to our brains about that. If we were moths, we would see that heat. And we would also see the unique heat signatures of each pheromone produced. And I sometimes wonder if we humans might be more capable of that than we give ourselves credit for. The spectrum of electromagnetic radiation we call visible light is processed by our optic nerve coming off the signals pouring into our retina, and it is processed by our brains as light and color and darkness and shape and form and movement. The electromagnetic spectrum we call sound is processed according to the vibrations it creates in our eardrum and our auditory nerve, carrying that to our brain, where we experience it in terms of tone and pitch and volume. And the shift we feel in the presence of another being is carried via the ventral branch of the vagus nerve to the amygdala and to the right frontal cortex of the brain, where it is processed as emotion. So we are feeling the world around us when we are in a coherent state, and feeling the way the world receives us when we are in a coherent state. We've all had the experience of walking into a room and knowing that something joyous or something devastating just happened there without having any cues. And that's that heart-centered perception kicking in. I'm increasingly convinced that we also have a fourth major neurological center, given the level of innervation in our generative organs, in our sex organs. I believe that that is a major center of perception and consciousness as well. I also think that operating from that level of awareness is actually the opposite of what we generally mean in English when we speak of someone thinking with their genitalia. I think there we're actually speaking of somebody thinking with their ego, which is part of their talking mind. And if somebody were actually thinking with their genitalia, they would be in a place that was much more fluidly responsive to the presence of other bodies around them, and to their own embodied presence, and to flows of pleasure therein. And so when we're in coherent states, when we're in a coherent heart state, the electromagnetic field of our heart pulls the electromagnetic field of our brain, of our gut, and of our sex into alignment, into coherence. So it becomes all one experience. And we evolved to spend most of our lives living in that state. And now we don't. So when we operate from that state of coherence, from that state of embodied presence, we find that our first motivation is connection. We want to connect with ourselves. We want to connect with our human and other than human kin. And if we face a challenge, our first instinct will be to seek help from our human or other than human kin, or to try to communicate with the source of the threat in order to negotiate a solution. It's only if we believe that neither of these are possible that we move out of that state of coherence. And for the past 500 years, and to some extent for the past 6,000 years in much of the world, but especially in the past 500 years, that has been really difficult because we have lived in a culture that has its origin in the violent separation of people from land and community. And that inherited trauma of separation makes it difficult for us to believe that connection is possible. And we also have lived in a culture where our daily survival is conditioned on our maintaining particular behaviors, and where if we make a wrong step, we could lose our access to food, we could lose our access to housing, we could lose our freedom of movement, we could lose love, we could lose life. And love is actually experienced by our bodies as its most fundamental need. We are very, very vulnerable creatures when we're born, dependent entirely on others for our survival. And even in adulthood, none of us can survive purely on our own. And so what threatens connection, threatens survival for us, even more than what threatens food or what threatens shelter, threatens survival for us. And so in a culture of enforced separation, in a culture of rugged individualism, in a culture where that the first layer of being that we call we has been violently severed, we have a hard time accessing that coherent state our bodies were born to flow in. And so we get knocked out of that state. And when we get knocked out of that state, when we get knocked out of the proper heart rhythm, we begin to move into disconnected states where we first move towards trying to do whatever we can to get out of the situation individually alive by fighting or running. And if we believe that escape or fighting are impossible, then we go into a state of collapse and of freeze. And the truth is, most of us in this culture spend most of our time in a low-grade version of one state or the other, either in a state of agitation where we are ready to take immediate, desperate action to get what we need, or in a state of just barely having emerged from collapse, where our sensation and motivation are dulled. And this brings an imbalance and incoherence to our whole systems when we are stuck in these states. Now, I also want to say these states are important survival states. We evolved them for a reason. And some people will speak of them as maladaptive. They'll say, fight, flight, or freeze is relevant if you're dealing with a mountain lion, but it's not relevant if you're dealing with a landlord who's demanding the rent. And I would say, actually, no, they're entirely relevant responses to the landlord demanding the rent. If when the landlord comes knocking on the door, you run out the back door, or you hide in the closet, or you open the door and punch the landlord in the face, all of those are relevant responses. But because you are engaging them in them as an individual, and because the landlord can appeal to the collective of the police to back him up, they aren't likely to be successful strategies. They are, however, collectively successful revolutionary strategies. Fight, flight, or freeze What's a general strike but a collective decision to freeze? And, if collectively everybody in your building decided that they were going to all move out at once to protest a rent hike, or all refuse to pay the rent and pretend not to be home when the landlord came to collect it, or even if everybody decided they were going to take the landlord out behind the building and beat the crap out of him, those would be relevant responses as well. They'd be more likely to be successful than the individual response. Now, I'm not endorsing these responses, but I'm saying that they are entirely evolutionarily relevant, but that we are more successful when we're able to act in community. But one of the problems of being in these states of constant threat is that we perceive community, connection, solidarity as unavailable. We might have them available to us as abstract concepts, but it's hard for us to be able to reach into that felt sense of their actually being present. And so we miss the ways in which those around us might be available to help. We miss the ways in which the voices of the wind and the water and the voices of the ancestors might be available for guidance as well. And so one of the things I say about this approach, about somatic herbalism, is that part of what we're doing is creating the necessary neuroendocrine connections for revolution. Because until we come into embodied presence, we can't really be in solidarity, and until we're in solidarity, we can't really create meaningful change together. And this is especially important to me because when I'm giving people herbs, a plant's life has been taken to create that medicine. And I feel like I only have the right to take a plant's life if what I'm doing is in service of the ecology that the plant and I are both part of. And so my work is really to bring people into deeper embodied presence, deeper connection, deeper resonance. In the process, we end up often dealing with the roots of a lot of the physiological challenges people are facing. If we look at the diseases that are causing the biggest problems in our culture, and it's interesting, even conventional medicine calls them the diseases of civilization. We can look, all of them really have their root in an incoherent set of signals moving through our bodies. Our nervous system, our endocrine system, and our immune response all respond to the same information, all respond to the felt sense of who we are and where we are and what's happening. And if our bodies are trapped in response to something happening in another time and place, as happens in trauma, then we will not respond coherently to what's actually happening now. We will not produce hormones at the right ratios. We will not recognize what is ourself and what is not ourself, what is a healthy part of the ecology that is us and what is not a healthy part of the ecology that is us in our immune response, and will be unsuccessful often in fighting off infectious disease, but end up attacking our own tissues in autoimmune disease. And so as a culture, we look at what's killing people, and we have cancer, which is fundamentally an immune dysregulation issue. We are all producing cancer cells all the time. It's our body's capacity to engage in surveillance to target and eliminate those cells that determines whether or not we develop what we would clinically call cancer. Absolutely, exposure to carcinogens is a part of that process. It is a necessary part, but not a sufficient part. Because even if we're exposed to carcinogens, if we are operating in a healthy and coherent way, our bodies would be able to identify and eliminate those cancer cells. But if we have misinformation about our experience, then we will end up not being able to properly identify and eliminate them. And so we look at places where cancer rates are high in this culture, and they tend to often that tends to often happen in marginalized communities for two reasons. One is that corporations and governments have determined that the economic cost of poisoning poor people is lower than the economic cost of poisoning rich people. But the other is that the stress of poverty and marginalization impairs immune response and thus makes people more susceptible to cancer. We can look at type 2 diabetes. We think of it primarily as a disease of diet, and absolutely diet is a necessary contributing factor. But we're finding more and more that actually what's probably driving insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes is elevated rates of the hormone cortisol, which is one of our stress hormones, which among other things increases insulin and increases blood sugar. And so people who are living in poor communities and people who are experiencing marginalization, people who have experienced trauma, are going to have higher cortisol levels, and that's going to make them more likely to develop type 2 diabetes and have that condition more resistant to dietary changes than we would expect it to be. We can look at heart disease as primarily a disease of inflammation and constriction, which are primarily stress responses. So all of these major killers within our contemporary society, all of these chronic illnesses that we're dealing with, have their root in our disconnection from embodied presence. And we can't cure everything by shifting embodied presence, but we can always bring healing by shifting embodied presence. My friend Peter Conway says the difference between being cured and being healed is that you can die healed. Healing is about being in a state of flow. Cure is about changing particular conditions. A salmon at the end of his navigation of the river back to his birthplace to spawn is living in flow at the moment of death. Death doesn't mean not being in flow. But if the salmon dies before swimming all the way upstream because the water is too hot and too shallow, then a salmon has died in a state that's outside that flow. And so with somatic herbalism, we work to bring people in flow by bringing subtle sensory signals to the body through the presence of minute doses of plants. And I'm going to touch briefly on three major body systems we work with and how and why, and then I'll open things up to more questions about this approach. And so first and foremost, we end up dealing with the nervous system, which is really determining our level of presence and awareness in this particular moment. Our impression of what's happening right now is expressed through our nervous system, and then through our nervous system influences the action of our organs and the action of our muscles. So every internal organ in our body except the adrenal glands is innervated by a nerve that branches off the ventral branch of the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve has two branches. All vertebrates have the ventral branch. All vertebrates have the dorsal branch. of the vagus nerve that runs along the spine. And all warm-blooded creatures have a ventral branch of the vagus nerve that runs parallel to the dorsal branch, but along the front of the body, connecting brain to heart, to solar plexus, and to sex, and to other nerves that branch out throughout the body to reach other internal organs and to reach our muscles. Parallel to it runs our sympathetic nervous system that innervates our adrenal glands. And when we are in a state of coherence, when we are in a state of a strong, healthy signal moving across the ventral branch of the vagus nerve, then what we call our parasympathetic response, what some call the rest and digest response, what Stephen Porges, the neurobiologist who originated polyvagal theory, calls the tend and befriend response, because it's also the place where we're open to connection, is dominant throughout our bodies. And it brings us into a state of openness and relaxation and of smooth function. When we move out of that state, as the strength of the parasympathetic weakens, the sympathetic response grows stronger, and we move into a state that's dominated by two molecules, adrenaline and norepinephrine, which make us focus outwardly on a single threat, and that single threat only. And we come out of coherence. We move into a state of hyperarousal. And if we collapse from that state, then eventually the norepinephrine and adrenaline drop down, and we come under the influence of cortisol, which among other things is a neurotransmitter that causes a very particular form of pessimism, where we look towards everything looking for the next possible threat. But we are unable to see the bigger picture as we shut down our cognition. So the Slovenian Marxist psychoanalyst Slavoj Žižek wrote something a few years ago saying, it's strange that in our culture it's easy for us to talk about the next asteroid strike or the next big storm or the next terrorist attack, to imagine these threats that could wipe us out instantaneously. But it's hard for us to have conversations about even modest changes to our political and economic and cultural systems that would result in a great improvement of our lives. And that's because collectively we are under the influence of cortisol much of the time, which makes us easily look to the immediate threat and have a hard time seeing what else is possible. It was interesting to me in my earlier years as an activist and journalist, spending time in communities in Latin America where people were under much greater physical threat than I've experienced in any of the communities I've been in North America, but where there was a level of calmness, a level of joyousness, a level of connection, and a level of complex political analysis that are largely lacking in this culture. And the reason why was people were experiencing solidarity. And because they were experiencing solidarity, because they were going through these experiences together as community, they were able to maintain that coherent heart rate, maintain that ideal vagal tone, and stay in embodied presence and be able to respond. Not that people didn't ever go into hyperarousal and hypoarousal, but there was a much greater vitality and presence in those communities than I tend to witness in far more privileged communities on this continent. And I really tie it to that existence of solidarity. And so herbally, we have two ways we can bring ourselves into that coherence. One is through profoundly acrid herbs that bring a sort of burning feeling at the back of the throat that then sends a strong signal along the ventral branch of the vagus nerve that brings us into a coherent presence. And lobelia would be the quintessential acrid herb that brings that instantaneous vagal reset, can bring that call right back into presence. And secondarily, aromatic herbs have an interesting role to play here because we co-evolved with plants, and our own internal regulation was never strictly internal. It was never, our emotional and sensory regulation was never supposed to be a strictly inside job. Our ancestors were interacting with plants in every moment. Their every inhalation was the breathing in of the exhalation of plants. Their every exhalation was breathed in by the plants, who changed their chemistry subtly in response, and we changed our chemistry subtly in response. So too of the pheromones released in our sweat. So too of all of the waters flowing out of our bodies. So too of the presence of our hearts. And so we evolved in a context where connection was available from the other than human world. And so our nervous systems evolved to associate the aromatic scents of plants, those light, easily wind-borne molecules that they release to send communication to each other, as an invitation to connection and communication. And so when we smell an aromatic plant, we move immediately into a parasympathetic state. When there are enough molecules of an aromatic plant in the air for our olfactory nerve to pick up on their presence, that automatically bypasses all of our sensory gating channels and goes directly to our amygdala to signal that we should come into a relaxed and open state to prepare to receive information. And so we do a tremendous amount of work with aromatic plants with my clients. Their taste and their scent bringing that invitation to connection after the acrid taste has brought that embodied presence where we can be more available to that other sensory input. And that in turn brings relaxation of our muscular structures, which allows us an increased freedom of movement and increased freedom of flow. But we then often still have the challenge of patterns that are held in our fascia, which hold patterns of movement and not movement, which hold the memory of the way in which we've held ourselves. So the fascia really consists of the superficial fascia, which is that gorgeous wet tissue right underneath our skin that picks up on subtle shifts in vibration, that picks up on subtle shifts in touch. That is such a sensual sensory organ, which our culture has horribly demonized. Our adipose tissue, our fat, is our superficial fascia, which is a sensory antenna of ours. So the radical anatomical scholar Gil Hedley, whose work I highly recommend to the non-squeamish, who does beautiful and sacred dissections of human bodies, layer by layer, showing the tissues, speaks of the fact that this is actually a really important tissue of attunement and connection for us, and that it is through the superficial fascia that the mama and the baby, who both have more superficial fascia at that time of pregnancy and time just after childbirth, or that time of being new in the world, are able to attune to each other's presence through that amplified ability to pick up on the rhythm of each other's heartbeats and the presence of each other's movement that comes through that contact of superficial fascia to superficial fascia mediated by skin. The same is true of anyone whose bodies we hold close. And then beneath the superficial fascia, we have the deep fascia, which we tend to call the connective tissue, which is made up essentially of two components, one being these collagen bundles, which when they are in their healthiest state are kind of like a wavy kelp forest. Well, the synovial fluid, interstitial fluids move across them, allowing them to wave back and forth, allowing for flow. But when we hold patterns of rigidity for an extended period of time, and when we have elevated levels of inflammation in our bodies, those collagen bundles become more rigid and they begin to obstruct flow. The obstruction of flow creates habitual patterns of tension in the body. So Wilhelm Reich wrote about this in many ways, anticipated much of this in the 1930s when he was observing a time of great cultural change. And in two vital texts, The Function of the Orgasm and The Mass Psychology of Fascism, he spoke about the ways in which 6,000 years of patriarchal civilization have trained us to restrict against the flow of eros in our bodies. So Freud spoke about the fact that civilization is based on the suppression and sublimation of libido, that we turn that erotic drive, which at its deepest level is a drive towards connection, and which extends beyond what our culture calls sexual. The Mormon ecofeminist writer Terry Tempest Williams speaks of the fact that erotic initially meant in connection, and she says it speaks poorly of our culture that we have concepts of the erotic and the unerotic, rather than a spectrum of different expressions of eros, expressions of the flow of life through us. And so Freud said that we had to cut that flow off in order to direct ourselves outward to build a civilization. And Freud, of course, also said happiness has no cultural value, which I think only becomes an acceptable statement if you place it behind Terence McKenna's observation that culture is not your friend. And Reich was actually speaking of the biology of this. And Reich was more on the McKenna side of the equation. He was saying that 6,000 years of repression and oppression have trained us to create armoring within our own bodies to restrict the flow of libido, to restrict the flow of embodied creative presence through our beings. And that in restricting that, we have also cut ourselves off from the ability to feel each other's presence. And so we have lost empathy in the process. And he spoke of the importance of bringing back the flow of ecstasy in order to break through that armoring, in order to break through our separation. And essentially he was talking about the biology of restoring the level of we. And so that happens in part at the level of the fascia, in part in allowing these structures of habitual movement and habitual constriction to become more fluid again, which I tend to work with by working with black cohosh to bring down the low-level inflammation in the collagen bundles throughout the fascia, and with the plants, the Asparagaceae family, Solomon seal and false Solomon seal and shatavari, and even the roots of garden asparagus to restore that fluid element and restore that pliability and restore that flow. And then we're going into the third place, which is the place of circulation. Where blood flows in our bodies is where awareness goes. The blood flow has been cut off is where awareness has been cut off. And as we restore awareness to parts of the body, we have to go slowly because those parts where awareness was cut off are kind of frozen in the moments of their last response. But when we find that what's awakened when blood flow returns to the tissues is something that is too intense, we're going to tend to want to work with cooling plants like lemon balm and rose and linden to slow and cool and soothe the circulation. And where what we're encountering is numbness, we're going to want to work with warming aromatic plants to stimulate that blood flow into the tissues. So ultimately, this ends up being a lot of what's at the core of my practice, along with finding the subtler senses of my own embodied sense of what a plant feels like and how a plant's medicine moves within bodies, and my sense of another person's embodied presence, and are working together towards finding, okay, what direction do we need to move experience in order to allow for greater embodied presence. And so we're working to just bring plants in a really subtle way to invite the body into a different possibility of response. And so I've been deepening and developing this way of working over the past several years, piecing together elements of the traditional Western herbalism that Matthew Wood helped to revive in the last generation, with elements of somatic psychology, elements of eco-psychology, and elements of magic. And this year we'll be offering an intensive training in working with people in this way, where beginning in late September, people will come from across the continent for a series of five-day intensives, where we will explore the theoretical frameworks of this approach, but also work on skills like pulse diagnosis, skills like attuning to heart-centered awareness and heart-centered awareness of another being's presence, attuning to listening to plants, and where you'll also have an opportunity to observe this all in practice in clinic. And we've brought in a series, we've brought in 3 human teachers who will be visiting teachers, bringing in some amazing perspectives. Brant Stickley, who is a classical Chinese medicine practitioner based in Portland, who delves deeply into the psychological and spiritual dimensions of Chinese medicine, approaching it from an animist cosmology, from a sense of the world as alive, and bodies as living fluid systems. And it's going to teach how to use classical Chinese pulse diagnosis in a Western somatic practice as a way of feeling what's happening in other people's bodies. Bring in Ray Swersey. They are a brave and brilliant and creative herbalist practicing in rural North Carolina, who does beautiful work around both meeting the needs of queer and trans people within their community, and also training other practitioners in how to work with queer and trans communities, and the whole process of queering herbalism, queering our anatomy, queering our sense of relationship to plants, queering our medicine. It also does really beautiful work with the subtle vibrational medicine of flower essences, and with training practitioners in how to take care of themselves. And so they will be coming to bring some of those perspectives from their work. and Kenneth Profrock, everybody's favorite rogue naturopath, who used to be a pharmaceutical research chemist and now is a druid and naturopath who weaves together the wildest ends of neurobiology and phytochemistry with an animist spiritual practice and a whole lot of grounding clinical experience. And Kenneth will be teaching about the fascia and about ways in which we can engage and shift present patterns within the fascia. And of course, our bodies and the bodies of the plants and the bodies of those who come to seek our help will be the greatest teachers of all in that process. So if people want to learn more about the details of that program, they can go to portlandschoolofherbalwisdom.com. And I will now open things up for questions and comments and responses and challenges. So if you would like to say something, you may unmute yourself. If you're having trouble unmuting yourself, you can type a note in the chat and I will unmute you. And so the floor is open. And when you're done speaking, please remute yourself so that we won't have thousands of echoes. Well, not thousands, but 29.
I had a question.
Yes.
You were talking about, this is definitely like a me question. So, but you were talking about the rigidity of collagen bundles.
Yes.
As a stress response. And you're gonna know this is a me question in like 2 seconds. What happens if you have the opposite problem?
Yeah.
Like if your collagen is weak and squishy and sparse.
Then your fascia has trouble holding form, and then that creates potential difficulties in holding boundaries with the world. And so that may have initially evolved, and I hadn't made this connection before, but that may have initially evolved, especially because weaker collagen is more common in neurodivergent people. And I believe that autistic biology evolved to be a biology of greater sensation on behalf of the community. So it may have been that weaker collagen and more fluid fascia may be more common in the autistic population because that allowed for a greater ability to be even more responsive to stimuli in the environment, but then in a contemporary context, along with a whole host of other challenges, including autoimmune elements of a lot of conditions relating to weak collagen, created a position that makes things much more untenable for a lot of people, and where we have to strengthen the collagen, which I've really only been able to find ways so far to do materially and in very limited ways. But I've found that bone broth and really large amounts of shatavari or Solomon seal can be of help in strengthening the collagen somewhat.
Do you think that there are behaviors or environments that can help someone find tissue strength?
Yes. And I think that it's really tricky because I feel like the majority of movement teachers in our culture have an idea of one ideal kind of movement for everybody. And so I find that actually what I tend to do in my own life, I tend to, whenever I come into a community, find a personal trainer whose intuitive sense of bodies I trust and work with them. And then I often end up recommending that person to my clients because I find that, and you know, personal trainers could be all over the map with this as well, but really good personal trainers who tend to really have a very individual approach and tend to have an intuition for individual bodies can often help bodies find the movement that they want. And I also think that exists across all kinds of movement practices. I've known some brilliant and deeply intuitive and very body positive yoga teachers who have been able to take yoga not as a rigid system, but rather as a science of movement and science of alignment, and work with people in really beautiful individual ways. I've also noticed that most yoga culture in North America is very focused on its idea of what a yogi's body should look like and be, and on trying to get everybody into the movements that they think reflect that body type. And so it becomes very individual. I also find that for a lot of people, ecstatic dance practices, because they tend to encourage fluid, intuitive movement, can be really helpful.
I used to dance that way a lot. Even very young, yeah. Are there, anyone feel free to interrupt me. Are there particular types of movements that you favor? Like, what are they?
Yeah, so personally, I've tended to find weightlifting to be extremely grounding to my nervous system. And
Me too.
yeah, and so, and part of it is that really strong stimulus, like there's that pressure pushing down, and then there's the feeling of the muscle engaging it. And that, first of all, requires a focused presence that brings me really out of my talking self. But secondly, that pressure itself is comforting, and the resistance against it also allows me to take some of the excess energy in my body and push it outward. I also find my body really loves swimming but hates chlorine. And I've been working over the past few months with somebody who engages in functional training, which is really more about sort of finding ways the bodies want to move. And I work a lot with resistance band-based strength training right now, which has an advantage over weights in that it allows for a broader range of movement and thus a different set of changes in the muscles and the fascia. And I also found, surprisingly, that boxing lessons really helped me in terms of orienting myself in space. And I think that's probably true of any martial art with the right teacher.
I wonder what, like, if there are more European equivalents to approaching movement as well, because I wonder what kind of practices like my ancestors did to orient themselves better in space. Yeah,
so and capitalism hit Europe first. And capitalism is very much regulation and regimentation of the body. And in fact, I really highly recommend to people Silvia Federici's essay for Gods and Radicals in praise of the dancing body, that talks about the ways that each iteration of capitalist culture uses this dominant technology as the model for bodily control and bodily discipline. And so right now we're in the era where people are talking about body hacking all the time because our bodies must be computers. And therefore, if we change the programming, we can override our body's resistance, which we can do, but it's not a very respectful way of relating to our bodies. And so I think, one aspect is that for people, I see Michelle just shared chop wood, carry water. And absolutely, for people, especially in rural communities, traditionally, just daily life would have brought that kind of right range of movement, as would ritual and celebratory dance. There are, I've known some people to find that fencing approached as a martial art can be a European martial art. I've personally been very curious about learning to engage in the Scottish heavy sports, but I haven't yet found a teacher. And I don't think I should just go start throwing telephone poles.
Well, actually, where I live, sometime this coming month, there's going to be like a Scottish cultural festival with Highland Games. So I'll try and see if anyone knows anyone out your way.
Nice. There was an article I read years ago in an exercise anthropology journal. And I think the methodology is probably not that great, but I really liked the results. And so it's one of those things that might not be factual, but there's an important truth to it. And it said that ancestral health was based on lifting heavy things, lots of long, slow movement, playing with dogs, and engaging in healthy sex. So I'm personally in favor of that workout plan, whether or not the anthropology of it is valid.
Yes. Okay, I'll mute myself in case anyone else wants to jump.
All right.
I had a quick question.
Yes.
You were talking about bone broth earlier for collagen.
Yeah.
Do you have any herbal ones for vegans for collagen?
No, I haven't found anything yet.
And this is the Chopwood and Carry Water card. I think that's what she was referring to, right? Getting the basics done.
Right.
So, yes, just tending to the originals. But you haven't found anything for vegans about collagen?
I mean, Solomon seal and shatavari, but I've not found a food source that really replenishes collagen. I'd be curious about some of the seaweeds.
That's what I was thinking, you know, like kelp and stuff like that, because I thought that was an alternative, but I only really knew that it had like 12 minerals that the body harbored, but I was wondering what you thought.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot of experience with seaweeds, but you know, I was recently on Inishmore in the Aran Islands where seaweed broths would have been the basis of a diet for a really, really long time.
Colette Baron Reed, by the way. Someone asked me what deck this was.
Oh, nice.
So, there you go.
Thank you.
All right, that's what I wanted to add. So thank you.
Thank you. Other questions or responses? So, and then we have a question from Ash. For those that may have an aversion to internal use of tinctures, for example, you've explored relationship with plant medicine. Have you explored relationship with plant medicines externally, say via infused oils, etc.? Definitely to some extent. I feel like topical applications of herbs, and especially topical applications of aromatic herbs, can make a really big difference for a lot of people. But I tend to work with things that can be given at drop doses internally, because I find that's where we can bring subtle changes that someone can reach for in an exact moment. And so for people with aversions to alcohol, I feel like probably the most promising form would be oxymels, which are vinegars preserved with honey. And you know, I've certainly made a black cohosh oxymel, which I found to be, which I like even better than I like the tincture. And so I would love to see a wider range of oxymels more commercially available. I feel like it's a really beautiful form of medicine that can make it that can make drop dose medicine available to people who don't want to work with alcohol. And we also have the question if sublingual would be okay. And absolutely, although you then do lose a little bit of the taste impression. And the taste impression is one piece of the medicine. But you still get a significant amount of information coming into your body anyway.
Okay, I had a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
What's your thoughts on black seed oil?
I don't have a relationship with it yet, and I never comment on something I haven't put into my own body.
Okay, I've tried it, and it's a pain in the ass to get used to at first because the
Mm-hmm.
taste is so strong, and it'll upset your stomach if you take on an empty stomach. But apparently, it suppresses a lot of ailments in the body, and it actually is a major detox. So I was just wondering what your expertise were on that. Anyway, you haven't tried it yet, so I won't go any further.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's okay. I know it's very important in Persian medicine.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk to you more about it.
Cool. And so we have a question about how many people we're accepting into the program and how much the program will cost. And so the program, we cap the program at 20 so that there will be a real community feeling to the cohort. And so people can get individual interaction and attention. Right now, I think we have 10 or 12 signed up. The program costs, bringing up the website right now. Let's see. The program costs, well, it's $3,400 if paid in full by tomorrow. I would say if you're listening to this this recording, we can extend that price for another week. So it's right now the website says $3,400 if paid in full by August 1st. We could change that to if paid in full by August 8th, and $3,700 if paid in full by October 1st. We also do have payment plans available for people. Unfortunately, we don't have scholarships available. We're just too new a program and have too few resources for that. But we'll do our best to work with people to make payment plans work. And I can also give people the dates of our modules, which will be September 27th through October 1st, November 8th through the 12th, January 10th through the 14th, March 7th through the 11th, and April 25th through the 29th. Any other questions or insights?
Yeah, I had one.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on herbal dosing for chakra balancing?
I would tend there to work, because we're working on making subtle shifts to the information flowing through the system, I would work with drop doses, so between 1 and 5 drops. That's where I generally work with anything that's about balancing or anything that is about shifting a chronic pattern. In acute illness or acute injury, I'll dose fairly high. And sometimes with nourishing herbs, I'll dose fairly high. But my preference is to go with low doses that bring really subtle signals into the body.
Okay, so when, say you have more trauma in one chakra than in another, you'd start low dose and then maybe up the dosage in that trauma-stricken area more?
No, I would keep the dose low. I feel like I work with people layer by layer, as though we're working through the layers of an onion. And generally speaking, I'll be addressing one pattern showing up in their body at a time. And we'll be addressing that through those small, subtle doses of a single plant or of a formula over time until that pattern shifts. And then once that pattern shifts, we look at, okay, what's the next layer beneath that? And then begin addressing that next layer.
Excellent. So it kind of complements like EFT, where
Right.
you grab a hold of the one entity and kiss it goodbye before
Absolutely.
Thank you, Sean.
Okay. Then there's a question about dosing digestive bitters. And I would say, generally speaking, with digestive bitters, I'll do between 3 and 5 drops 15 minutes before eating. And then Amy has a question about, do I find that people who've had innate fear as an integral part of their upbringing tend to have a more challenging experience when working to come back into balance? So I would say pretty much all of us have been moved out of balance by some constellation of fear, shame, and guilt. And that in every system I'm working with some elements of both. And so, and I would say each body works at its own pace. And so it's hard for me to make generalizations. I've worked with people who lived in states of absolute terror for much of their lives, who somehow were able to come to something pretty close to coherence, and where it's been just a subtle shift to bring them back. I've worked with others for whom a single experience brought a deep enough fear that it's a long time working to help their body come into attunement with current reality. So yeah, it varies so much from person to person. And I work with what's showing up in the person in front of me as they're sitting in front of me, that we can agree is a pattern they want to shift. So we have an informed consent there and just work pattern by pattern. So we meet people where they're at. Sometimes we stretch a little bit into places that are just beginning to come into awareness for someone, but you always work with where they're we're at that. We always work at the level that the person is aware of and consenting to. And so that can be a long process or a short process. And I find for most people it's a process that is a winding process and a spiraling process, and has times of seeming setbacks and times of seeming progress, and where ultimately our whole lives are a journey into embodiment. We also have a question from V. I'm curious if you have certain magical practices that you recommend to use at the same time as taking a microdose of an herb. And I would say definitely coming into like really simple somatic practices ultimately are magical practices. And so coming into that place of being aware of your feet on the floor, being aware of gravity pulling on you, being aware of your heartbeat, allow you to come into a place of being more receptive to what's coming in. I also find that for a lot of people, if they can have a picture of the herb they're working with at hand and sit with that picture, that can bring another level of attunement. Erin, you look like something. Oh, go ahead.
Oh. The folks that you have make your formulations.
Yes.
I was curious about what type of alcohol they use. Like, is it 200 proof or?
Yeah. And I
It
believe
is?
it's cane sugar alcohol they're using. I'll double check on that. I know that's true of the Canadian supplier I work with, Harmonic Arts.
Oh yeah.
I'm in the U.S. I work with Five Flavors Herbs out of Berkeley. I can't remember if it's Berkeley or Oakland, but out of the Bay Area, and I'm pretty sure they're using cane alcohol, cane
Mm.
sugar.
Audette from Harmonic Arts says hi.
Yeah.
Is that him?
No, she loves you, or he loves you. Sorry.
Harmonic Arts is a great company. But pretty much every supplier is also going to vary the alcohol percentage according to the plant. So you're going to want a high percentage of alcohol to extract from resins and from roots. You're going to want a low percentage of alcohol to extract from flowers and leaves. But they'll be pretty much always using as close to pure alcohol as you can get, and then diluting that with water to shift the alcohol ratio.
Right. Are there places that non-registered people can get alcohol like that?
It varies according to states and provinces.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I really want to make my own, but
Yeah. Like I remember being in BC and knowing people who would, when I knew somebody driving into Alberta, have them stock up.
yeah, I'll check
And
on. Yeah.
in the States, I know that Alchemical Solutions sells organic alcohol by mail to anybody in the state where it's legal. But I don't know about Canadian suppliers.
I'll take a look. Thanks.
Some people have told me that if you go to a pharmacy and tell the pharmacist that you're requiring the alcohol for medicinal reasons, you can sometimes get it in jurisdictions where it's otherwise harder to get it. But I've not tried that myself.
Noted.
And I'm one of those shady East Coast herbalists who likes to use Irish whiskey to make my tinctures.
I would if I could.
I was curious, what is the best carrier oil, and also should I use different carrier oils for different herbs?
Yeah, and also for different people. It's going to vary a lot according to the person's constitution. But I would say that probably sesame oil is the most universally well received by the skin carrier oil for people of different constitutions.
All right. The smell and the well, I suppose the color's not a big deal, but the smell isn't going to overpower the herb or the detox of it. I don't know how that works.
Yeah, it depends on the herb. It depends on the person's relationship to the smell.
All right. Well, thank you. Oh, and what kind of herbs should a woman avoid to avoid elevating estrogen levels?
Hops, and that's it. I really think that most other things we talk about with herbs allegedly affecting hormonal levels are bullshit.
All right.
that hops will materially elevate estrogen levels. We see in the way that it changes things like breast growth in people of all sexes. Pine pollen probably elevates or may elevate testosterone. I've read strong claims in either direction. But I work with a lot of people in the trans community, and the trans community has experimented with all kinds of herbs in terms of potential shifts in hormonal expression. It has found that there isn't an herbal replacement for estrogen or testosterone exogenously in making a physical transition. And that seems to me, along with ecological evidence, to point in the direction that we probably don't have really the really direct levels of influence on hormones of herbs that we've tended to speak of over the past 20 years. It's basically been driven by the fact that most research into herbs is being done by herbal product companies that tend to use fairly questionable methodologies in order to be able to make health claims.
Okay, I actually have a few transgender friends, and one is male transitioning to female, so I'll relate that to him, because I actually told him to stock up on milk thistle.
Yeah, milk thistle is going to be really helpful to anybody changing levels of hormones moving through their bodies, because it's going to support the liver without really without interfering with those changing hormonal levels. And changing hormonal levels of any kind tax the liver. So reishi and milk thistle are both herbs that I recommend to people who are taking hormones for any reason. I would also recommend that if somebody is trying to change their hormonal balances, well, it depends on what direction they're trying to change them in. So if somebody's trying to increase a particular hormone in their bodies, they should avoid St. John's wort, because it increases the liver's elimination of hormones and hormone-like substances. On the other hand, if, say, you're somebody coming off of hormonal birth control and you want your body to come back into its more organic regulation, then I would give St. John's wort in order to push those excess exogenous hormones out of the body.
Thank you.
And Sandy asks, can I recommend any books that bridge the state of our culture today with the body, and why some of us are more sensitive than others in picking up the troubles of our times and our bodies? And I would say, ultimately, Stephen Buhner's Secret Teachings of Plants and Plant Intelligence in the Imaginal Realms would be the two books that I feel like address that the best. There are lots of other books that have pockets of information, but I find that I've mostly needed to create a patchwork. And mostly I've created that patchwork by spending lots of time filtering and translating really pathologizing articles and getting down to the data and recontextualizing conclusions.
I have another question.
Yes.
I found that recently there was like a flower that I feel like I kind of have like a plant crush on.
Beautiful.
Yeah, like I love them. And when I first kind of developed this plant crush, I noticed that it is lavender, and I noticed that lavender appeared a lot in commercial settings for me, which was interesting. I haven't seen lavender anywhere wild or anything yet, and that's not that common probably where I live. But when that kind of perhaps like almost erotic in the way you were talking about earlier, awareness of a particular plant comes into being, like what does that usually indicate, other than like you need this medicine? Because that seems pretty logical, but I wondered if there's anything else to it.
I don't really differentiate them from human crushes. And so with human crushes, there are all kinds of different things that our attraction to a person can mean. And really the meaning, so my friend Reed Wildermuth wrote a great article called What Do They Mean? Talking about the meaning of meaning, and about how meaning is really a map of relationship. And we can look at the other way we use the word meaning in English. If we say, you mean the world to me, it means my relationship with you is so profound that it changes my relationship with everything else.
Mm,
And if I say you mean nothing to me, that means that I'm severing relationship with you.
mm-hmm.
And so meaning is contextual and relational, which is one of the reasons I get really frustrated with like the books about animals or plants that say, eagle means high flying vision from above. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
yeah, sometimes eagles can mean that, but sometimes eagle above can mean salmon below, or it's all relational. It all emerges from we are in a world of living beings moving fluidly in relation to each other, and when our erotic senses are engaged by relation with another being, the meaning of that relationship will be created by the relationship we develop.
Yeah, I recently did, like yesterday, I think, an intuitive birth chart reading because I'm still learning how to do the fancy astrology. And a lot of I got some clues from looking up what certain things meant and a general idea, but it was it hit much closer to home for her the more I kind of weft those meanings with like the few details I knew about her together. Yeah, and it felt really good. Mm-hmm.
Any more questions or reflections before we wrap up? All right. Well, thank you all for your presence tonight. And we'll be hopefully making the recording of this available in the next few days if you want to go back and learn more or you want to share this with other people. And have a beautiful night.